So I'm hearing a lot about how the Ukrainians should stop. They should negotiate peace. They're not getting the material that they need from their allies. Their allies really don't want to help. All these kinds of questions or statements. And I'm going to show you two videos here. One is Margarita Simonian, and the other is John Mearsheimer. Now, Margarita is talking about how ungrateful Ukrainians are. After all, we gave them all this stuff. It's a little clip from the Russian Media Monitor. They do great work. The other one is from John Mearsheimer, and he's an academic, and he's talking about what he sees as how the war will end. And he's indirectly making my case, and I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. Here is the first clip. This is the Margarita Simonian uh, clip, and it's from the Russian Media Monitor. Special thanks to the Russian Media Monitor, as always, for the great work that they do. No one thanked us that Odessa is theirs now. And then what? We gifted it to them? We did. New Year's is coming. Santa Claus Yeltsin gave them gifts. Santa Claus Khrushchev gifted them Crimea. Santa Claus Lenin gave them gifts in his time. And Santa Claus Stalin starved them out in the Holodomor. There's a reason that Ukrainians are not really all that grateful to you for your benevolence. And they weren't thanking Mother Russia for this for the rest of their days. So here is the perspective. You Ukrainians are just ungrateful children who should be dependent on Russia and grateful to Russia for whatever benevolence Russia has sought to bestow upon you. And if you're not, then you need to have your heads knocked together until we can get some common sense back in your brains. They weren't thinking what hand of Mother Russia they hadn't kissed yet for these gifts, for the health of Mother Russia. No, yeah, they're not. They're absolutely opposed to that because what Mother Russia has done is like some deranged psycho mother turned against them. If this is the metaphor that you want, Mother is abusing her children and ought to be taken away. That's actually a better metaphor than where you're going. No, they started to destroy our people, us, Russia. Like, how did they destroy your people? They didn't cross the border. They didn't do anything to you. Crossed the border with 190,000 troops and tanks. Everything Russian. The very Russianness on our own territories that we gifted to them. But see, it's our own territories that we gifted to them. So it's Ukrainian land is still their territories, right? So did you give it to them or not? Like, let's say you gave it to them. Are you taking it back? Because that's what it sounds like you're doing. Just think about it. I remember when I worked in Crimea, I often went there for business in the early 2000s. At night, people were rubbing out road signs. Their age-old Russian names were changed to Ukrainian. They put up these new signs. So now, if you gave it to them, they should be able to do with it what they want. And if they want to use Ukrainian as a language, you should let them. I mean, let's say that you gave it to them. I'm not arguing that that is actually, in fact, what happened. But let's say that you gave it to them. Shouldn't they be able to do, or did it come with strings attached? As though they had nothing better to do. At night, they walked around with an aerosol and markers and rewrote the road signs. Do you know when it was? I was there in 2001, 2000 and 2001. When did they start teaching the Holodomor story? In the 1990s. Yeah, because before the 1990s, they couldn't because they were being repressed by you. Do you think that in Ukraine, they could have taught the Holodomor in the middle while they were being dominated by Soviets and still live? So that's the reason that they only started teaching about this then. This was an ugly, ugly stain on your history, Margarita. And you seem to think like, well, they just started teaching about this recently. Come on, like think through this. When we still had blooming liberalism as our ideology, why didn't they want to live with us? Well, let's ask you that. Why do you think they don't want to live with you? You can't figure this out yet? If you can't figure out why they don't want to live with you, you've got a whole different set of problems than what I thought you had. In my opinion, ingratitude is one of the worst traits in a person, not to mention a nation. I'm afraid of ungrateful people. I believe the ungrateful people that you're talking about are more afraid of when Russia comes across the border with tanks. See, that's different thing. Like you're comparing apples and watermelons here. This isn't even apples and oranges. Ungratefulness is not the same as coming in and killing, raping, kidnapping, doing all these other atrocities that you're doing. An ungrateful person can't be a good person, especially an ungrateful nation. Here we have an ingratitude multiplied by the lack of historical memory. No, 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 it's not a lack of historical memory. It's actually because they have a historical memory that they're acting the way that they are. Multiplied by the fantastic gall to a third power. As a result, this is what it came to. This is all I can say about Ukraine. Okay, so that's the mentality that's driving the Russians. Now, let's go over and listen to Mearsheimer. Now, Mearsheimer is an academic. He's being interviewed by this guy, and he believes that the U.S. is kind of, pushing the conflict, and it wouldn't have started without the U.S.'s intervention, and because of NATO. Now, I disagree with Mearsheimer, but I want you to hear what he has to say because he's kind of making a point of why they shouldn't be doing well. Okay, at any rate, I'm not going to take that away from him. He's one of the people, one of the voices out there saying, well, NATO expansion is causing this. Okay, but all the Warsaw Pact countries from the Soviet times have fled from the Soviet Union to NATO's protection. And there's a reason for that. It's because of what Russia is and what Russia does. Let's listen to him and you'll see what I'm talking about here.
So maybe you can correct me, but I believe in the power of individuals, especially individual leaders. Again, whether it's Biden or Trump or whoever, goes into a room and says in a way that's convincing that no more NATO expansion. And actually just on a basic human level, ask the question of why are we doing all this senseless killing? And look at the interest of one, Russia, look at the interest of the other, Ukraine. Their interests are pretty simple. And say,
but first, it's not senseless killing. It is Ukrainians defending themselves against an aggressor. It's not just senseless killing.
The United States is going to stay out of this. We're not going to expand NATO. And say all that in a way that's convincing, which is NATO expansion is silly at this point. China's
No. The NATO expansion is not silly at this point. The reason that NATO expansion is necessary for Ukraine is because if Ukraine was part of NATO, this never would have happened. And this is precisely the point. Romania understood it. Poland understood it. Lithuania understood it. Look, if I'm not part of NATO, then Russia over here, they're probably going to try to come back my direction, and I don't want that.
The big threat. We're not going to do this kind of conflict escalation with Russia. The Cold War is over. Let's normalize relations.
Well, let me just embellish your argument.
So, but can you normalize relations? Like, if you're Ukraine and you're so ungrateful, as Margarita was talking about, can you normalize relations with Russia if you're Ukraine? No, not unless you're willing to just be subservient, second or third class citizens to Russia and just be used as their vassal state.
Okay.
Thank you. I need it.
If we say there's a sliver of a chance that you can do this.
Okay, so that's the first thing, and this is Mearsheimer, and again, he's a pretty brilliant academic. I just disagree with him, and he's talking about that there's not much of a chance that you'll actually be able to get to this place where you could all get all parties in a room and negotiate this out. There's only a sliver of a chance, but what he's going to say about what he thinks is the reality of what will happen on the other side is stunning.
I do think there is a sliver of a chance. Let me just embellish your point.
Thank you. I need all the help I can get.
Two things have to be done here, in my opinion. One is Ukraine has to become neutral. And it has to completely sever all security ties with the West.
And is there any security for Ukraine if they do become neutral? That's the question. But he's not answering that. And you'd be foolish to think that they would be, because remember, the way that Margarita just talked about Ukraine was that Ukraine is really, we gifted this to you, you're really ours. Okay?
Right. It's not like you can say we're not going to expand NATO to include Ukraine, but we're going to continue to have some loose security arrangement with Ukraine. None of that. It has to be completely severed. Ukraine has to be on its own. Okay. And number two, Ukraine has to accept the fact that the Russians are going to keep the 4 oblasts that they've now annexed.
Okay. So Ukraine has to be on its own, and Ukraine has to accept that it's lost those 4 oblasts. If it can do that, well, then what happens? They get to, live in peace and dignity and wonder and, the awe of living right next to Russia and how awesome Russia is. Really? Do you think that that's going to work? Do you think that they're ever going to have any security in that kind of arrangement?
Crimea, right? The Russians are not going to give them back. And what you really want to do if you're Zelensky or who's ever running Ukraine in this scenario that we're positing is you want to make sure the Russians don't take another 4 oblasts.
What? What's he talking about? He's talking about you make peace now, or the Russians are going to take another 4 oblasts. That's what he's saying.
Kyiv and Odessa, right? If I'm playing Putin's hand and this war goes on, I'm thinking about taking 4 more oblasts. I want to take about 43%.
Isn't that amazing? Look at this map. There goes Kharkiv and all the way down to Odessa. Like, just what? Like, you don't even control all of Donetsk and Zaporizhia or even all of Luhansk, and you're talking about that you're going to take 4 more oblasts? Okay.
Percent of Ukraine and annex it to Russia, right? And I certainly want Odessa, and I certainly want Kharkiv, and I want the.
And Odessa's right up against Moldova. So Moldova, by the way, is not part of NATO, and that makes them vulnerable. So he's making precisely the argument that I'm saying, that the reason that they have run into NATO is for their security against Russia. Okay.
2 oblasts in between as well.
Right. Literally, or as leverage in negotiation.
No,
for Ukraine neutrality.
I want them literally. I want to conquer them literally. But my point to you is, if we can begin to talk about cutting a deal now, you may be able to head that kind of aggression off at the pass.
Yeah.
In other words,
until they can rearm and take it again. Look, Dmitry Medvedev put this out last summer. This was Medvedev once again's dreams of disintegration of Ukraine, publishing these maps. And this was in Ukrainian Pravda, so it's explaining what he did. But I saw this on Dmitry Medvedev's Telegram, and this was a map that he put out. Yeah, Poland will take its swath, Romania will take its swath, even Hungary will get a little bit, and this will be all that's left of Ukraine. Russia will gobble up all the rest of this, right? They have no intent. The mentality is, this is really ours. We're just taking back our historic lands, and you can't stop us, so we're going to come do it. And that's where they're going to go. So the idea that Simon was saying was that they're ungrateful, and I mean, how could they turn against us and do this thing? Well, we have to take it back. And this is, to a man, what I see in the Russian propaganda space. Now, they're also talking about some other interesting nuance that I'm just recently starting to see pop up, and that is that they're talking about it as a civil war, that they're actually one people, and there's a civil war between these Russians that some call themselves Ukrainians, like the way that they have done this before was call them, they say they have this political identity as Ukrainian, but they're really Russians, and that's not it at all. They're 2 separate peoples who have gone on 2 separate paths. Okay, that's all that I have to say. I'm curious what you think. Put your comments in the comments below, and I'll read as much as I can. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.